dedicated to journalists whose persistence hunting the facts makes possible our democracy. In 1838, Abraham Lincoln asked his fellow Americans, "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws, and that we improve to the last, that we remained free to the last, that we revered his name to the last, that during his long sleep we permitted no hostile foot to pass over or desecrate his resting place, shall be that which to learn the last trump shall awaken our Washington." Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. System theorists coined an acronym to separate beguiling beliefs from real-world facts. Rather than being seduced by what a system is intended to do, they focus on what it in fact does. Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. The U.S. Space Shuttle Atlantis successfully docked with Russian space station Mir in outer space on June 29, 1995. When linked, Atlantis and Mir together formed the largest spacecraft ever in orbit. In December 1999, a Bermuda-registered company said Tuesday that it had reached an agreement to lease Russia's Mir space station in a last-ditch effort to keep the orbiting platform alive as a commercial venture. In April 2000, 2 cosmonauts entered the rundown station and prepared to make it habitable again, nearly 8 months after the last crew shut it down. For the first time, private companies will be able to arrange to use an orbiting platform in space without having to get government approval, as long as they have enough cash. Sergei K. Gromov, chief engineer of the state-run space agency Energia, which built Mir, said, "Mir has in fact become a private business. Today, Mir is open to any commercial offers that may come along." Launched by the Soviet Union in 1986, Mir was the 8th and most sophisticated of a series of manned stations the country put into orbit. It was designed to last 5 years, but after the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian space program fell on hard times, and it never had enough money to replace the station. Russia began cooperating with the United States on space exploration in the mid-1990s, and 7 NASA astronauts spent time on Mir in preparation for the 16-nation, $60 billion International Space Station, now under construction. 2 modules of the station have been launched, but the program has fallen 2 years behind schedule, in large part because of Russia's inability to meet its financial commitments to the project. NASA officials, who are eager to get the new station operating, have urged Russia to abandon Mir and focus its energy on the international project. For many Russians, however, Mir remains an important symbol of the international prestige their nation once had. Similarly, the space shuttle symbolizes the former strength of the United States. Government officials agreed only reluctantly to give up on Mir and were overjoyed when an entrepreneur stepped forward with the money to save the station. MirCorp president Jeffrey Mamber said at the time, "We think that we can come up with clever, imaginative ways to use a manned orbiting platform. God bless NASA and all the government space agencies, but we want to unleash the full imagination of the private sector." In November 2000, Roscosmos decided to deorbit Mir. The controlled atmospheric entry of the Russian space station Mir was on March 23, 2001. Mark Burnett wrote, "Nature strips away the veneer we show one another every day, at which point people become who they really are." Burnett has long espoused a Hobbesian worldview, and when he launched Survivor, a zero-sum ethos was integral to the show. In 2001, Mr. Burnett told CNN, "It's quite a mean game, just like life is kind of a mean game. Everyone's out for themselves." On Survivor, the competitors were split into teams or tribes. In this raw arena, Burnett suggested, viewers could glimpse the cruel essence of human nature. It was undeniably compelling to watch contestants of different ages, body types, and dispositions negotiate the primordial challenges of making fire, securing shelter, and foraging for food. At the same time, the scenario was extravagantly contrived. The castaways were shadowed by camera crews, and helicopters thundered around the island, gathering aerial shots. Moreover, the contestants had been selected for their charisma and their combustibility. "It's all about the casting," Burnett once observed. "As a producer, my job is to make choices and who to work with and put on camera." Mr. Burnett was always searching for someone with the sort of personality that could break through the clutter. In casting sessions, Burnett sometimes goaded people to see how they responded to conflict. Mark Burnett's real genius was in marketing. "I looked on Survivor as much as a marketing vehicle as a television show," Burnett once explained. Long before he met Trump, Burnett had developed a Panglossian confidence in the power of branding. In 2001, Mr. Burnett told the New York Times, "I believe we're going to see something like the Microsoft Grand Canyon National Park. The government won't take care of all that. Companies will." Dan Kores, a spokesman for Mr. Trump, who later had as a client Jeffrey Epstein, said of the July 1987 Moscow trip, "Mr. Trump met with a lot of the economic and financial advisors in the Politburo." Mr. Trump's public company's collapse arguably began in 1999, just 3 years after spending about $60 million to buy back the former Trump Regency Hotel and pumping in millions for renovations. The company closed it. The company spent another $26 million to demolish the building, taking a $125 million write-off. In 2000, Mr. Trump fired the chief executive of his casino company and installed himself in the role, promising he would turn things around. The share price was by then hovering near $3. Revenues at other Atlantic City casinos rose 18% from 1997 through 2002. Mr. Trump's fell by 1%. Had Mr. Trump's revenues grown at the rate of other Atlantic City casinos, his company could have made its interest payments and possibly registered a profit. But with sagging revenues and high costs, his casinos had too little money for renovations and improvements, which are vital for hotels to attract guests. The public company never logged a profitable year. Mr. Trump attributed his declining market share in those years to the fact that his 3 casinos were competing with one another, a tacit acknowledgement that he overbuilt. That was the bad news. The good news is that I saved a lot of money in terms of dealing with costs. Mark Burnett changed the way Americans think about television. What he deals in is non-scripted drama, dramality, as he likes to call it. With Survivor in 2000, Mr. Burnett not only pulled in an astonishing 51 million viewers, he also single-handedly rejuvenated CBS. In the beginning of 2001, Mr. Burnett has sold a new show to NBC with the working title Destination Mir. In this show, the contestant who emerges victorious from the made-for-TV astronaut training competition wins the opportunity to be strapped inside a Soyuz rocket and blasted into outer space. Burnett has been negotiating with Russian officials for months over Destination Mir, but recent reports on how the space station is about to fall out of the sky have, to say the least, complicated his plans. Still, he believes the show can be pulled off. Mr. Burnett is openly contemptuous of even a bit of negative thinking. He looks at it this way: I think Mir is going to be hard only as a political thing. The show will be easy. I really want to do a space show, and typically I'm quite good at making things happen. Half crowing and half cowed, Mr. Burnett said, Putin is involved. Yes, that Putin. For nearly 2 decades, Mr. Burnett has spoken about his desire to make a television show with Vladimir Putin. In 2001, he sought to enlist Putin in a project called Destination Mir, a reality competition in which the winner would be sent into space. The idea was scuttled after Russia decommissioned the Mir space station. In 2000, back in the United States following 6 years living in Russia, Michael Caputo was hired by Gazprom Media. Mr. Caputo's role would be to improve Putin's and the Russian government's image in the U.S. In 2001, Mr. Caputo worked for Gazprom Media as they invested in and took control of NTV, a Russian national television station that was owned by an oligarch. Mr. Caputo said, my direction was to set meetings in Washington with the media and in New York City for corporate CEO, for Gazprom Media CEO, Alfred Koch. To capitalize on his new business model, Mr. Trump struck a deal with a Florida developer to attach his name to 6 high-rises in Sunny Isles just outside Miami. Without having to put up a dime of his own money, Trump would receive a cut of the profits. Gil Dezer, the Sunny Isles developer, said, Russians love the Trump brand. A local broker told the Washington Post that 1/3 of the 500 apartments he'd sold went to Russian speakers. So many bought the Trump-branded apartments, in fact, that the area became known as Little Moscow. Many of the units were sold by a native of Uzbekistan who had immigrated from the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Her business was so brisk that she soon began bringing Russian tour groups to Sunny Isles to view the properties. According to a Reuters investigation, at least 63 buyers with Russian addresses or passports spent $98 million on Trump's properties in South Florida. What's more, another 1/3 of the units, more than 700 in all, were bought by shadowy shell companies that concealed the true owners. An investigation by the Miami Herald found that at least 13 buyers in the Florida complex have been the target of government investigations, either personally or through their companies, including members of a Russian-American organized crime group. 2 buyers in Sunny Isles, Anatoly Golubchik and Michael Sale, were convicted for taking part in a massive international gambling and money laundering syndicate that was run out of Trump Tower in New York. According to the FBI, the ring was operating under the protection of the Russian mafia. The influx of Russian money did more than save Trump's business from ruin. It set the stage for the next phase of his career. In a September 2002 interview, Jock Howard Stern asked Mr. Trump if he supported the looming invasion of Iraq. Mr. Trump responded, "Yeah, I guess so. You know, I wish the first time it was done correctly." Well, he has either got to do something or not do something, perhaps because perhaps we shouldn't be doing it yet, and perhaps we should be waiting for the United Nations, you know. I think he's doing a very good job. I think the Iraqi situation is a problem, and I think the economy is a much bigger problem as far as the president is concerned. On January 28, 2003, Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that while military action against Iraq was unwarranted, if Iraq impeded UN weapons inspectors, Russia could reach agreement with the United States on other, tougher solutions. As a young man selling t-shirts on the boardwalk on Venice Beach, Mr. Burnett had been handed a copy of The Art of the Deal by a passing rollerblader. Burnett said that he had read it and that it had changed his life. He thought, what a legend this guy Trump is. In early 2003, Mark Burnett called Mr. Trump and pitched The Apprentice, a reality TV show set in the business world. The Apprentice portrayed Trump not as a skeezy hustler who huddles with local mobsters, but as a plutocrat with impeccable business instincts and unparalleled wealth, a titan who always seems to be climbing out of helicopters or into limousines. Jonathan Braun, an editor who started working with Burnett on Survivor and then worked on the first 6 seasons of The Apprentice, said, "Most of us knew he was a fake. He had just gone through I don't know how many bankruptcies, but we made him out to be the most important person in the world. It was like making the court jester the king." The entire premise of The Apprentice was something of a con. Bill Pruitt, another producer, recalled, "We walked through the offices and saw chipped furniture. We saw a crumbling empire at every turn. Our job was to make it seem otherwise." In 2003, the Trump siblings gathered at Trump Tower for one of their periodic updates on their inherited empire. As always, Robert Trump drove into Manhattan with several of his lieutenants. Donald Trump appeared with Alan H. Weisselberg, who had worked for Fred Trump for 2 decades before becoming his son's chief financial officer. The sisters, Mary Ann Trump Barry and Elizabeth Trump Grau, were there as well. The meeting followed the usual routine, a financial report, a rundown of operational issues, and then the real business, distributing profits to each Trump. The task of handing out the checks fell to Steve Gurian, the empire's finance chief. A moment later, Donald Trump abruptly changed the course of his family's history. He said it was a good time to sell. Fred Trump's empire, in fact, was continuing to produce healthy profits, and selling contradicted his stated wish to keep his legacy in the family. Mr. Trump insisted that the real estate market had peaked and that the time was right, according to a person familiar with the meeting. He was also, once again, in financial trouble. Mr. Trump's Atlantic City casinos were veering towards another bankruptcy. Yet, if his sudden push to sell stunned the room, it met with no apparent resistance from the siblings. Mr. Trump's signature skill, drumming up publicity for the Trump brand, would sit this one out. He directed his brother Robert to solicit private bids, saying he wanted the sale handled quickly and quietly. 3 potential bidders were given access to the finances of Fred Trump's empire, 37 apartment complexes and several shopping centers. Ruby Scron, a major New York City landlord, quickly emerged as the favorite. In December 2003, Mr. Scron called Donald Trump and they came to an agreement. Mr. Scron paid $705.6 million for most of the empire, which included paying off the Trump's mortgages. A few remaining properties were sold to other buyers, bringing the total sales price to $737.9 million. Mao Zedong said, "Politics is war without bloodshed, while war is politics with bloodshed." Political warfare is difficult to align with Western understandings of war and peace. However, the rise of right-wing groups radicalized by the proliferation of new and cheap communication technologies has forced America to recognize it. Less violent modes of warfare abound, but are recognizable as warfare because of their dynamic, adversarial, and zero-sum nature. Scholars and practitioners of war are comfortable with the economic, electronic, psychological, and cyber forms of warfare, among many others, but no one expects carnage from their employment. Warfare is not defined by body counts, but by violence. Violence, as an instrument, not an organizing principle, is inherent to political warfare. Whether harnessing the massed power of a social movement, raising a surrogate military force, or targeting specific personalities, political warfare clearly includes violent means. Short of conventional war does not mean short of force. The term political warfare demystifies current Russian actions by suggesting historical parallels and anchors strategic thinking in the stream of past academic and military study. Russia's leader has never really stopped believing that the United States is the principal enemy. Therefore, the increasing presence of the United States, NATO, or the European Union, EU, and former Soviet countries is perceived as a dagger aimed at the heart of Russia. Moreover, there is a historic fear that the Western world intends to minimize Russia and keep it from its rightful place in international affairs. Russia believes that the West wants to ensure that it never again regains its role on the world stage, which makes any dealings with the West not just competitive but adversarial. There is a direct and linear progression in Russian political warfare doctrine, from Lenin's Bolshevik Party to Putin's Russian Federation. On April 2, 2004, NATO formally welcomed 7 additional members into the alliance, stretching its security umbrella to the borders of Russia. In May 2004, Vladimir Putin was re-elected president for a second term. In 2004, Michael Caputo worked with Paul Manafort's company to organize U.S. media coverage of the Russian CEO Oleg Deripaska's denied application for a U.S. visa. In a confidential strategy plan, Mr. Manafort proposed that he would influence politics, business dealings, and news coverage inside the United States, Europe, and former Soviet republics to benefit President Vladimir Putin's government. The effort, Manafort wrote, will be offering a great service that can refocus both internally and externally the policies of the Putin government. During a 2004 panel at the Museum of Television and Radio in Los Angeles, Mr. Trump said, "I don't want to have cameras all over my office, dealing with contractors, politicians, mobsters, and everyone else I have to deal with in my business." You know, mobsters don't like, as they're talking to me, having cameras all over the room. It would play well on television, but it doesn't play well with them. At the same 2004 panel, Burnett made it clear that, with The Apprentice, he was selling an archetype. Donald is the real current-day version of a tycoon. Donald will say whatever Donald wants to say. He takes no prisoners. If you're Donald's friend, he'll defend you all day long. If you're not, he's going to kill you. And that's very American. What makes the world a safe place right now? I think it's American dollars, which come from taxes, which come because of Donald Trump. This is Donald Trump giving back. All these buildings. How many carpenters, steelworkers, construction guys, cleaners, bellboys, and maids are working through the Trump entrepreneurial vision? And what Donald Trump is doing, and what The Apprentice is about, is to show Americans that you have to be an entrepreneur. The Apprentice was about what makes America great, Mark Burnett said. On March 31st, 2004, the auditors of Trump's cash-starved casino company, Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts, raised substantial doubt about its ability to continue as a viable business. The auditors, Ernst & Young, expressed concerns after reviewing Trump Hotels' financial results for 2002 and 2003. The company published Ernst's concerns in an addendum to its annual report with the Securities and Exchange Commission. According to the report, the company's $1.8 billion bond debt is so burdensome that its interest payments entirely depleted the company's operating income last year, contributing to an $87.3 million loss. Trump Hotels also said that it anticipates, but it cannot ensure, that it will have enough money on hand to provide for a May interest payment of about $73.1 million. The company is trying to negotiate a refinancing deal with its bondholders. Mr. Trump, the chairman and chief executive, received $1.5 million for his services but failed to earn a bonus. While the winner of The Apprentice will get the dream job of a lifetime, a year at Mr. Trump's feet, absorbing even more of his business expertise, the master himself now faces an unwieldy group of investors who are muttering a word that has repeatedly hounded him during his career as a real estate developer and casino mogul: bankruptcy. In April 2004, Trump Hotels began talks with major creditors to address its suffocating debt burden. Asked about the possibility that bondholders may force Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts into a prepackaged bankruptcy proceeding, which some of them privately say they are considering if other efforts fail to corral the debt, Mr. Trump is quick to distance himself from any personal financial liability. "This has nothing to do with me," Mr. Trump said, even though he is chairman and chief executive of the company that bears his name and uses his initials, DJT, as its ticker symbol. "This has to do with a company in which I'm a major shareholder," Mr. Trump said. To be sure, Mr. Trump's representatives could reach a deal with bondholders and avert a bankruptcy filing, although bondholders would have to swallow a significant discount on their investment. Some say they would take comfort in the fact that a bank, and not Mr. Trump, would be overseeing the company's coffers. Should bondholders accept that deal, it would eliminate a hefty portion of the debt, leave Mr. Trump with only a 20% stake in the new company, which would be called Trump International, even though it currently has no overseas operations, and flick Mr. Trump from the chief executive's perch. Mr. Trump would retain the title of chairman and would continue promoting his namesake operation. "There is more of a gun to his head now than when Mr. Trump dealt with creditors in past years," said one bondholder. Although Mr. Trump has long had contentious relations with his creditors, sometimes threatening to withhold interest payments, both sides say tempers have cooled in recent weeks. Mr. Trump and New Jersey gambling regulators said they were confident that the company would be able to make 2 interest payments of about $73.1 million each that come due in May and November, though Trump Hotels has indicated in public filings that it will need to take advantage of a 30-day grace period to make the May payment on time. Even so, it will continue to be a tight squeeze. The company, which has published only unaudited financial statements for the last year, carries $1.8 billion worth of debt on its balance sheet. Its bond payments are so burdensome that its annual interest expense of $228.5 million last year wiped out its operating income of $139.4 million, contributing to an $87.3 million loss for the year. Losses are not new to Mr. Trump's company. It has not posted an annual profit since it went public in 1995. It also ran afoul of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2002, when the regulatory agency slapped Trump Hotels with a cease and desist order for producing misleading financial statements in an earlier quarter. Bond rating agencies downgraded Trump Hotels' debt last month. If a debt restructuring does not happen soon, analysts say the company's financial picture may become bleaker. Marvin Rothman, a casino analyst who has had a long history of heated disputes with Mr. Trump, said, "You have to understand the Donald's psyche. He is really giving up total control here for a serious infusion of cash. The company has real problems. For him to let go is a sign that he is throwing in the towel." People close to the debt negotiations said Mr. Trump had not been leading the talks. That task, they said, has fallen to Scott C. Butera, Trump Hotels' executive vice president. In an interview just published, Mr. Butera said the company had no plan to file for bankruptcy protection, but he acknowledged the hazards of navigating a clear course in negotiations that involve about 20 important groups of bondholders, among them Oak Tree Capital, Putnam Investments, Trust Company of the West, and Lowe's. Mr. Butera said, "Talking to bondholders is like herding cats, but I think that they're finally speaking with one voice. I think we'll always be able to make our debt payments, but I'm concerned about more than that. You don't want to be sitting around clipping coupons and watching the property deteriorate." The company has been forced to cut costs and plow excess cash into hefty interest payments rather than the casinos. Barbara Capehart, an analyst at KDP Investment Advisors, said Trump Hotels had barely enough cash to support day-to-day maintenance and refurbishment and could not afford expansions, like the new hotel tower the Taj Mahal needs to accommodate more guests. Some bondholders, none of whom would speak for attribution, described the Trump Hotels situation as more dire. They say the company is desperate for cash and needs to get its house in order as quickly as possible. After peaking at $34 in 1996, Trump Hotels' stock plunged to a low of $1.51 late last year. This year, largely on the back of the popularity of The Apprentice, the stock has climbed, even though a bankruptcy filing could make the company's equity worthless. Since Mr. Trump started promoting the show, the stock price has risen 62% to $3.40. Mr. Trump said, if anything, the brand has gotten more valuable because of the show. The name has helped the casinos in terms of the drawing of the crowds. Of course, Mr. Trump is known to wage war when he negotiates, and he said last week that he was prepared to counterattack if bondholders became combative about a restructuring. "We're talking about a fight that takes years," Mr. Trump warned, noting that such a financial battle would ruin the business. "I don't think anybody would want that to happen," he added. Mr. Trump said he was optimistic that his newest book, How to Get Rich, might offer some valuable lessons for his bondholders. A bondholder could read How to Get Rich and say, "You know what? This is a good time to make a deal," he said. Bondholders seem to be more pragmatic about what they can learn from Mr. Trump, including what value he brings to the casino enterprise to which they remain tethered. On May 4, 2004, the Trump children spent most of the day signing away ownership of what their father had doggedly built over 70 years, with the dream that it would never leave his family. Donald Trump's cut $177.3 million. The sale received little news coverage, and an article in the Staten Island Advance included the rarest of phrases. Trump did not return a phone call seeking comment. The banks financing Mr. Schron's purchase valued Fred Trump's empire at nearly $1 billion. Donald Trump, master dealmaker, had sold his father's empire for hundreds of millions less than it was worth. Within a year of the sale, Mr. Trump spent $149 million in cash on a rapid series of transactions that bolstered his billionaire bona fides. In June 2004, he agreed to pay $73 million to buy out his partner in the planned Trump International Hotel and Tower in Chicago. Mr. Trump told reporters, "I'm just buying it with my own cash." He paid $55 million in cash to make peace with his casino creditors. Mr. Trump put up $21 million in cash to help finance his purchase of Maison de l'Amitié, a waterfront mansion in Palm Beach, Florida, that he later sold to a Russian oligarch.